Welcome to Handpicked podcast. This season, we're featuring episodes recorded as part of the Voicing Change project. We're your hosts, Charlie Spring
and Lane Young. So, what's the Voicing Change team tackling today?
Today is the first of 2 episodes in which we look at agroecology.
Okay, I think I remember that word from season 3 of Handpicked.
We heard from Drs. Eve Nimmo and Erin Nelson then about agroecological food systems in Brazil and Ontario. And actually, we'll be hearing from both of them in this episode as well. I'll be introducing this Voicing Change episode with a brief reminder of what agroecology means to us as the Voicing Change team. So let's get to it.
Pegodita Kodiriwi.
Ma en lando para manhã de opus.
Este é mudança de voz.
Welcome to the Voicing Change podcast. In this episode, our guests from Canada and Brazil will share some examples and perspectives on agroecology. Agroecology has taken on new meanings over time, but its global spread has been spearheaded by social movements of small-scale food producers demanding fairness in their food systems, particularly in Latin America. Agroecology is many things. It's a scientific practice of applying ecological principles to food production, which really starts in the field, but it's also a movement builder, with people gathering around this term and this movement and learning from each other. Importantly, I think agroecology goes beyond specific techniques and questions of yield, etc., to ask difficult questions about how our food systems are organised. For example, are food producers democratically involved in shaping policies that might, say, protect food producers and workers against exploitation by corporations? Agroecology's holistic approach, I think, encourages us to take seriously issues like how to balance questions of food security with food provider livelihoods as well as environmental impacts. But we should note that not everyone who practices agroecology uses the term agroecology. Indigenous and peasant communities have been enacting many of its principles since time immemorial. So we hope that today's conversation will show you some of the hope and power that's being wielded by small-scale and Indigenous farmers and harvesters around the world, at a time when many are facing threats of a fast-changing climate, tough economic pressures, and also the rise of authoritarian governments. So here's the conversation, where Voicing Change members Andrew and Eve interview Erin Nelson.
So my name is Erin Nelson. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Guelph in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. And I work on agroecology in Ontario, Canada, also in Cuba and Mexico.
My name is Eve Nimmo. I am a research associate at the Laurier Centre for Sustainable Food Systems at Wilfrid Laurier University. And I'm also the president of an NGO called SEDERVA, which is the Centre for the Development and Education of Erva Mate Systems in Brazil.
And I'm Andrew Spring. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Ontario. So today we're going to talk a little bit about agroecology. Agroecology is a theme that has kind of been identified as part of our conversations with our partners in Kenya and certainly Brazil and certainly emerging in the north. Today we'd like to have just a little bit of a background and talk about what is agroecology and maybe a little bit about maybe what it looks like. So Erin, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. So I guess theoretically, the official definition of agroecology would be something like it's the ecology of food systems. And it tends to be thought of as a scientific discipline. So there's like the academic side of agroecology. It's about research, and there's a real focus on agronomy and ecology there. And then it's also a set of practices that happen on a farm or wherever you might be producing food. And then it also tends to be thought of as a broader social movement that's about making food system change. So you've got kind of the academic piece, the farming, food production piece, and then there's a real social change piece as well that's about shifting power dynamics in food systems. At the heart of it, I think what agroecology is really about is building food and farming systems that are more ecologically sustainable, that are grounded in what communities want to do and the way they want to produce food, and that it enables communities and people within them to have sustainable livelihoods, to live well, to eat well, to steward their lands well, and to have some control over their own food systems.
You know, we talk about agroecology and certainly what you described sounds wonderful, but what does it actually look like?
So it's interesting. When I was first introduced to agroecology, it was when I was working in Cuba back in 2006. And I'd never heard the term before because it hadn't been used that widely in Canada or globally, but it has been around as a term for a long time in Latin America. I guess if I'm thinking about what agroecology looks like on the ground, there are a few important things. One would be when I first started visiting agroecological farms, one of the things that stood out was just how biodiverse they were. So conservation of biodiversity is a really key piece of agroecology. And there's just a function to that ecologically, and it's also just so beautiful. I think that's an important piece in thinking about what agroecology is. It's messy and it's beautiful and it's challenging, but you can just feel that there's so much life in an agroecological space. Conserving resources is also really important, and I think agroecology tends to not be really prescriptive about certain practices, but it's really about a mindset of trying to create more closed loop systems and reduce the amount of inputs that need to be brought into a food production systems. I think about some of the agroecological farmers I've met. In Cuba, for example, there's this amazing farmer, and he developed this drip irrigation system that doesn't require any electricity, and it uses old recycled pop bottles that have been cut in half and sort of recycled medical tubing that he's got rigged to provide drip irrigation to his crops. And he's actually patented that innovation and shared it across the island. So that's, there's resource conservation there. There's also really creative, locally based innovation, which is, I think, another really important part of what agroecology is.
I typically think of agroecology as like a traditional knowledge source of food growing. So I don't know if you want to kind of jump off that a little bit.
Again, I think about the example of Cuba. What I've tended to see there is a really interesting collaboration between more sort of formalized research centers and scientists and local farmers who have been doing agroecological production for, in some cases, a long time. So it maybe differs a little bit from how it might look in the Northwest Territories or how it might look in Brazil, but there's a real emphasis on knowledge co-production and co-creation, and really strong reciprocal relationships between farmers working on the ground and drawing on their own practical experiential knowledge, and then research scientists who might have labs and more sort of formalized research methods that they're using. And those two sort of ways of thinking and ways of producing knowledge come together so that ideally on the farm, when you're doing the production, you can draw on the best of both of those knowledge systems. And I know when I do work on agroecology here in the Ontario context, and I should say not all the farmers who are doing this work or the scientists, not everyone involved in this is going to use the term agroecology. So in Ontario, a lot of the farmers that I would work with would call it ecological agriculture, not agroecology.
To me, agroecology was this traditional knowledge system of food growing in global south or Latin America or something that happened elsewhere. But the way you kind of describe it now, it's much more of like synergistic and relationships between people who produce food and like researchers. And it just seems more like this organic collaboration of a lot of different people.
Yeah, I think collaboration is a really important word. I would say that kind of collaboration of lots of different people, young people who have their own innovative ideas and maybe have gone to university and studied agroecology. I also did work in Mexico, and the University of Chapingo there has an agroecology program, and they educate and train people from largely the southern states in Mexico. So there's a lot of Indigenous students who come to the university and bring their own traditional ways of knowing about food production. They take a degree and perhaps a degree in agroecology and blend that knowledge with their traditional farming knowledge and bring sort of both of those elements back to their communities.
As Erin was saying, this collaboration between traditional knowledges, Indigenous knowledges, and academic knowledges is actually really productive, a really productive way of improving the sustainability of farming practices, improving livelihoods, bringing more value to the products that people are producing, and recognizing the value that this knowledge has, right? So it's interesting that the way that agroecology, even though it comes from South America, in some parts of South America, it's not seen necessarily as scientific practice because it has this connotation of being mystical.
Can I pick up on that? Sure. I think another negative connotation that it sometimes has is that you can't produce enough food. It's not productive, an agroecological system. And actually, there's so much evidence to the contrary that demonstrates that yields of a particular crop might not be as high in an agroecological system. But if you look at the system as a whole and the resources that are being brought in and the amount of food and other ecosystem goods and services that could be produced, actually an agroecological system is much more productive than a conventional system. And I think if you think about climate change and the crises that are on our horizon in terms of food production, soil health, natural resource health, agroecology to me is really the way forward. I was reading the IPCC report that just came out a few months ago, and they talk specifically about land-based efforts to mitigate climate change. And it's huge, the potential to use our land management as a way to mitigate climate change. But it's this untapped potential, and there's so much information out there and so much knowledge about agroecological production, and yet it's not getting the traction that it could. And that's where I think that social movement piece comes in, because there's really a need for policy change. One of the reasons I find it so inspiring to work on agroecology in Cuba is because the national government supports it. So they have a whole research and development sector and an extension sector that's focused on supporting farmers to engage in agroecology, which is kind of the opposite of a lot of other places. So I do think that's an important piece of agroecology, is shifting power dynamics, shifting systems, shifting policies to make these kinds of food production systems more viable. Because there's all of these structural things that push farmers into a more conventional orientation. And ideally, the push would go the other way. Now you've got me talking about agroecology and I can't stop.
So because the last question was like, how is it a tool for change? And I think you just nailed that one, right? Farmers are being pushed into this one mode of operating that we know is bad, that we know fails.
That they often know fails and doesn't work. But yet, if that's where the subsidies push them, if that's where the policies push them, if that's the only way that they can make a living for themselves and their family. But I mean, I think also it's important, like, I'm not a farmer, right? So, and agroecology is hard. And I think we expect that the burden of taking risks and doing the work, gaining the knowledge, managing the systems against a backdrop of drought and resource instability and all of these other issues, that burden is on the farmers themselves. I think it is important, especially for people who aren't doing the food production and aren't doing agroecology on the ground, to also recognize how challenging it is. You know, it's not easy to manage an agroecological system. It requires a lot of knowledge and expertise.
But that's one of the reasons why the partnerships between research and farmers is so important, because researchers can actually take on some of that burden in some ways. Like the work that we do in Brazil, in Brapa Forestry, is replicating those systems to take those risky steps, to try those things out that maybe farmers are like, well, yeah, this might be a good idea, maybe we should try, but we don't want them to take on that risk. And so having those partnerships with research scientists who can implement some of these practices, test them, and see the possible outcomes, I think is really important, because then it doesn't put the burden on the farmers to just follow, oh, well, we think, the scientists think this might be a good idea. No, we're going to test it and give options. And it's not prescriptive either, which is really important, right? Is that it's not a system, a one size fits all system, right? And I think that that's one thing that's very attractive about agroecology, is that you can do so many different things within a property. You can have conventional crops, you can have agroforestry systems, you can have gardens, you can have fruit production, you can have livestock production, and they can all be integrated into a system. A lot of farmers, I think, feel that moving away from that conventional crop structure is really risky. So they have to not only see that it could work, but have, researchers helping to demonstrate how to do that as well. And obviously the exchange of information between farmers who have done that, right?
Well, I was just going to say, the role for civil society organizations too, and farmer associations, like an organization like Sederva that brings farmers together and provides a voice for them as a collective, I think is really important. I know in Mexico, there was the network of local organic farmers markets has been really important in raising the profile of local ecological farmers in that country. There's the National Association of Small Farmers in Cuba. There's the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario in Ontario. And I think all of those organizations that work to really strengthen farmer networks play a really important role in that collaboration too. So, you've got the farmers, you've got the research centers or scientists, and you also have civil society organizations and networks. They're all an important piece of the puzzle.
So what you're describing to me is essentially this community of practice that all groups and part of this project have been working to build. And it's one of those things that you never think of, that act of supporting agroecology is actually agroecology itself. For a place like the North that has very little experience growing food, we've seen agroecology as a way of actually bridging the gap between a place that has no kind of cultural background in food growing to meet it with the culture of the people who live there, right? So stewardship is the language we talk about, research and monitoring and being stewards of the land and taking care of the land. Those are the principles of the northern food system, and they reflect a lot in agroecology. Just the food just kind of happens to walk around as opposed to kind of being grown. And so, if we have an opportunity in the North to think about how agriculture is going to develop, then why wouldn't it develop in this framework of agroecology that speaks to kind of the Dene principles and then the culture of the communities up north, right? So Eve, can you walk us through some of what agroecology looks like in Brazil?
We work in southern Brazil in a biome called the Agroecology forest. Agroecology has various manifestations in Brazil depending on where you are in the country, obviously, because it's a very large country with a lot of different biomes and a lot of different practices, a lot of different traditional knowledges. And so where we work, we mostly work with yerba mate producers, and yerba mate is a tea that is consumed by a lot of people in southern South America that's made from leaves of the yerba mate tree. So the agroecology around these agroforestry systems, we define it as such because it is a system that, as Erin was saying, is kind of a closed loop system. And so it uses the biodiversity of the region, of the forest, as a benefit to the system. And so yerba mate is a tree that grows in the understory of the Agroecology forest. It's naturally a shade-loving tree. And so it's really important to have forest cover where yerba mate is grown and produced. And so over generations and based on traditional knowledges and Indigenous knowledges in the region, the system has developed into a part of the property on most small-scale farms has a forest that has yerba mate in it. And not only yerba mate, but also native fruit species, as well as often livestock production in the forest with other associated crops and products on the farm. For example, agroecological gardens that it's actually often the women in the family that care for the gardens that have a wide range of fruits and vegetables that are used by the family. The small-scale farmers that we work with, they might not necessarily identify themselves as agroecologists, but from our perspective, what they do is agroecology because they have created on-farm systems that are quite sustainable and they're quite diverse. And so there's a lot of agrobiodiversity because of the different kinds of crops that are produced, but also because they have a forest aspect in an agroforestry system in which several products are used from the forest. The products that come from the forest are quite diverse as well. So there's yerba mate, but there's also the long-living trees that are iconic of the region, such as the Agroecology tree and several other tree species, which are really important for forest conservation in the region. And so as an agroecological system, most of these farms are quite self-sustainable because they grow a lot of the food on the property. They take advantage of the resources of the forest and use them in a sustainable way. And they also are really actually quite important for maintaining water cycles in the region and maintaining native flora and fauna, mitigating some of the effects of climate change because there is still forest as opposed to other parts of the state where all the forest has been cut down, which they have serious problems with drought and contamination of the soil. So for us, agroecology is working with these farmers that although they may not see themselves as agroecologists are maintaining those practices, those traditional practices that mean that a farm is a sustainable entity, really, that supports forest conservation and water conservation and biodiversity conservation.
The more I listen to both Erin and yourself speak about agroecology, the more it really kind of describes the relationship between the people and the land, right? And this is the bridge for the northern food systems and the work that we're doing in the Northwest Territories, is that taking care of the land and the land takes care of you is something we talk about a lot. And it seems that's just the way that agroecologists or Indigenous communities in the North or whatever people identify as, it's just the way they kind of operate, right? So I just find it really interesting that it's just a different way of producing food that kind of takes care of the land and stewards the land. And I think that's really the message that kind of speaks across a lot of the communities that we work with as part of this project is, everyone's trying to make a livelihood off the land in some way. And agroecology is a way of like taking care of that to make sure that future generations can also kind of take care of the land, right? And also have that livelihood.
Thinking about the future in future generations, I think is actually kind of an important point about agroecology, is that a lot of the farmers that we talk to, they're very concerned about what's going to happen, what the legacy they're leaving for their children. We were speaking with a farmer last week, and he said, what I'm doing right now on the farm isn't necessarily for me. I might not benefit from this, but my children will. And it's really important to remember that we have to kind of get out of the mindset of, short-term gains, long-term decimation, right? And I think that's what agroecology does. It makes us think more long-term. So maybe a farmer would make a lot of money off a soy crop 5 or 6 years, but what happens next? What will happen to that land for his or her children, right? And so I think that thinking about the legacy and the legacy that we farmers and what we do as researchers and practitioners, what we can help to do is to start thinking about those long-term impacts and how to help farmers to navigate the pressures of the current conventional food system, because often their resistance to conventional agriculture is seen as outdated and backwards and not modern and really frowned upon by a lot of agricultural researchers and agricultural institutions. And so creating those networks of people that they can recognize themselves as allies, not just as us as researchers, but other farmers and in civil society organizations, and creating that community of people, I think is really important, that solidarity, because it helps people to realize that they're not alone and that they're, continuing the work that their grandfather or their great-grandfather did isn't backwards. It's not outdated. It's actually very future looking.
Reflect on that is valuing that kind of traditional knowledge and that kind of knowledge that exists in communities. And I think this is, again, one of the reasons why we're trying to do this whole project, this whole Voicing Change, is to really kind of amplify those voices, because it is a system that works, and it is a system that regenerates, and it is a system that is resilient. And I think this is, the conversations that we want to have in the communities that we work with is about how they're really kind of fostering this change as a way of making this kind of like whole societal change towards being more sustainable in the face of all the kind of climate change impacts and other pressures that are kind of deteriorating our kind of natural systems, right? We think, how do we feed so many people in the future? And it's a bit more than that. It's about how do we live in the future, and how do we have clean water in the future? And it's all kind of linked together. And I think agroecology, has a lot of meanings, but it is this kind of term of people living sustainably with the planet, right?
And thank you for listening to this episode of Voicing Change. Editing and sound design for this episode is by Narayan Subramaniam. Our music is composed by Ali Razmi. Voicing Change is produced with support from the Laurier Centre for Sustainable Food Systems, Wilfrid Laurier University, the Centre for International Governance Innovation, and the Balzilli School of International Affairs.